Hey there, historians. Let's head back across the pond to the United States to look at the United States' territorial expansion and political development. American nationalism manifested itself in an insatiable hunger to trek into the frontier or unsettled territory in the West. Many believed in their manifest destiny to overspread the continent allotted by Providence for the free development of their yearly multiplying millions. In other words, there were a lot of Americans. They needed places to live and land to farm. Their view was that because they brought democracy, progress, and prosperity with them, that God ordained their resettlement in the West. In that spirit, the early 19th century saw a great expansion of U.S. territory. Throughout that expansion, important questions about equality, democracy, and freedom shaped the political and economic landscape in the United States. Some democratic reforms were made, allowing more people to participate in the political process. But major flaws were revealed, showing that Americans did not yet live up to the values their founding documents espoused. As we learn about American expansion, keep these guiding questions in mind. How did westward expansion help shape American democratic values? How did westward expansion expose inequities in American society? And how did westward expansion set the United States on a path toward civil war? And for a big picture question, how did the introduction of democratic values impact American settlement and disrupt the economy? When the U.S. first sought independence from Great Britain, one motivating factor was a restriction for moving west. Naturally, when independence was won, many Americans looked to settle the frontier in Ohio, Kentucky, and Tennessee. Settling in a new area far from civilization represented true freedom because nearly all decisions were made by local people. As Western settlement grew, inhabitants were subjected to the political, economic, and social influence of others. So, in some ways, Americans' manifest destiny was to continually expand throughout the continent, repeating the great experiment of democracy over and over again. But settling west led to questions. Should existing states expand their own territory and power, or should western counties, like Kentucky, become independently governed states? What happens to Congress if states are continually added, and what does this mean for the citizens of pre-existing states? In 1787, under the Articles of Confederation, Congress passed the Northwest and Southwest Ordinances, creating a procedure for newly settled lands to apply for statehood. In the Confederation, politicians feared centralized power in one place. They had just revolted against a monarchy. So, rather than allowing states like Virginia to expand their borders and their power indefinitely, they agreed to welcome new states into the Union, complete with political representation. As settlers streamed westward, new questions were raised about who would be allowed to engage in the democratic process. Before the 1820s, most states gave voting rights only to landowners. These members of society were typically wealthy, better educated, and politically engaged. The Founding Fathers feared that letting everyone vote would lead to mob rule, or anti-democratic coercive majority rule. But Western states like Kentucky and Tennessee promoted immigration from Eastern states by removing the land ownership requirement for voting, allowing more people to vote. Over time, politicians in all states made the same change to voting rights because they didn't want Western settlement to leech power away from larger Eastern states. Let's dig into our first guiding question. How did westward expansion help shape American democratic values? The United States was still far from a true representative democracy. While free white men could vote regardless of land ownership, non white men, women, enslaved people, and indentured servants were unable to vote or run for elected office, shutting them out of the political process. Huge population growth throughout the early 19th century also led to popular support for government policy known as Indian removal. Americans repeatedly engaged in military campaigns in the West, gaining leverage over Native Americans, pushing their reserved lands further west. And in the 1830s, the Indian Removal Act forced Native Americans out of many states and began concentrating their populations into smaller and smaller reservations even further west. Many states also endorsed the practice of slavery, which led to tremendous economic growth. The increasingly industrial economy depended on being the world's leading producer of cotton, which was grown in the South. Northern textile manufacturers benefited from this practice as well because the cotton was cheap. Throughout the first half of the 19th century, most northern states banned the practice of slavery on the grounds that it was morally wrong and did not align with the declaration that all men are created equal and have inalienable rights endowed by their Creator. However, Northern politicians did little to eliminate slavery nationwide because they were unsure about what would happen to the economy. It wasn't just Southern farms that were dependent on the institution, but also banks, factories, and international trade. In fact, as more states joined the Union, Congress tensely maintained a balance of political power between slave states and free states, in a similar way to how European states balanced military and economic power to avoid war. This was most famously argued when Missouri applied for statehood in 1819. Northerners wanted Missouri, which was north of the Mason-Dixon line, to be a free state, prohibiting slavery. Southerners, and the inhabitants of Missouri, who already owned enslaved people, wanted Missouri to allow slavery. The only way to settle the issue without instantly provoking a civil war was to allow Missouri to enter the Union as a slave state, while creating a new state out of a north province of Massachusetts, called Maine, which became a free state. This kept the balance of power, solving the short-term issue of regional tensions between the North and South, but did little to solve the long-term problem of America being a house divided on the issue of slavery. Let's take a second to answer another guiding question. How did westward expansion expose inequities in American society? Americans acquired lands in Louisiana, Florida, Texas, Mexico, and Oregon throughout the 19th century. In most cases, Americans had already established settlements in those regions to strengthen their land claims. Some historians believe that settling the West was about achieving the ideals espoused by the American Declaration of Independence. Yet, because those new states provided economic opportunities and freedom, settling the West became popular, romantic even. A gold rush in California and the invention of steamboats, steam locomotives, and the telegraph didn't exactly slow things down either. As these regions grew in population, they began to apply for statehood, returning Congress to the perpetual question of the balance of power between slave states and free states. By the mid-1820s, Southern Americans had so heavily invested in enslaved people and cotton production that disrupting that industry would have devastating effects on the regional, national, and international economy. From a Northern perspective, slavery was abhorrent and must be ended regardless of the political and economic consequences. But from a Southern perspective, expansion must occur so that Southerners could protect themselves from the tyranny of Northern morality. Southerners advocated for states' rights and the ability to make their own decisions about issues like slavery, taxes, and other issues. Isn't that what democracy is all about? For our final guiding question, how did westward expansion set the United States on a path towards civil war? By the 1850s, American political parties realigned around the issue of slavery, with Northern Republicans favoring abolition and Southern Democrats entrenching themselves in the institution. The election of Republican Abraham Lincoln, the first president from an abolitionist party, put American democracy to the test. This political realignment made Americans' new manifest destiny a civil war, as a house divided against itself cannot stand. As we continue our study of the expansion of political rights in the 19th century, look out for new amendments to the U.S. Constitution as a result of the Civil War. As always, keep your eyes open because history is everywhere. Hey!